The photo arrived at 7:14 p.m., just as Naomi Carter was striking a match over the last candle on a dining table set for two. And in one silent second, the life she had been protecting with both hands began to collapse. The penthouse glowed in soft amber light, every crystal reflection warm enough to fool a lonely heart into believing in permanence. She had spent the afternoon moving carefully through the apartment, one hand resting now and then on the gentle curve of her 7-month belly, the other smoothing linen napkins, adjusting silverware, and checking the oven clock as if devotion itself could keep a marriage from slipping through her fingers. Outside, Manhattan shimmered beneath a cold March sky, its towers blinking like distant promises, but inside the Whitmore residence, the silence had already started to change shape. Adrian had told her he was in Zurich for a board negotiation, something urgent, something unavoidable, something that would keep him away on the one night she had hoped to tell him the truth she had been carrying like a small private sunrise. On the marble counter beside a bouquet of white roses sat a cream envelope containing the sonogram she had planned to place in his hands after dinner, along with a pair of tiny cashmere baby booties folded inside tissue paper. She had imagined his face softening. She had imagined surprise, then joy, then the kind of quiet apology a man gives when he realizes work had stolen too much time from what mattered most. Naomi was still holding that fragile dream when her phone lit up on the table. It was not Adrian. It was a message request from an unknown international number, and for one irrational breath, she thought perhaps he had arranged something extravagant and theatrical, some European gesture meant to make up for the distance between them. But when she opened the image, the room around her seemed to lose air. Adrian stood beneath a canopy of white flowers in Rome, wearing a black tuxedo she had chosen with him last winter for an awards gala they never attended. Beside him stood Vanessa Holloway in an ivory gown, one manicured hand lifted just enough for the camera to catch the diamond on her finger. They were smiling. Not politely, not publicly, intimately, as if the world had already blessed what should never have existed. Naomi did not scream. She did not drop the phone. She simply stared, her face reflected faintly in the darkened glass behind the table, and pressed her palm against her unborn child, as though instinct alone could shield the baby from betrayal traveling across an ocean. Then came the second message, just 6 words beneath the photograph. He chose her. Thought you should know. Somewhere in the city, a siren passed. Somewhere down the hall, the refrigerator hummed on as if nothing sacred had just broken. Naomi lowered herself slowly into the velvet dining chair Adrian had once said looked like it belonged in a Paris hotel, and for the first time in her marriage, she understood that luxury could be the cruelest disguise of all. The candles flickered. The steak rested untouched beneath silver covers. Her wedding ring caught the light when her hand trembled, sending one sharp glint across the sonogram envelope. She looked at it for a long moment, then back at the photo, and in the unbearable stillness of that beautifully staged evening, Naomi Carter realized her husband had not merely gone abroad. He had gone there to replace her. And before the night was over, she would call the man who had abandoned her and tell him the one truth that had the power to haunt him for the rest of his life. Naomi called him at 7:32 p.m., after the candles had burned low enough to soften the room into shadows and the city beyond the glass had turned into 1,000 indifferent lights. Adrian answered on the 4th ring. His voice arrived smooth and distant, carrying the polished calm of a man who had learned how to make absence sound reasonable. He said her name the way he always did in public, gentle enough to pass for affection, measured enough to keep the truth hidden. For a moment, Naomi said nothing. She could hear faint music behind him, the murmur of elegant laughter, the muted clink of crystal, and somewhere in the background, a woman speaking in a low voice that did not belong anywhere near her marriage. Naomi lowered her gaze to the sonogram. Envelope resting beside her untouched plate, the corner of it illuminated by candlelight like evidence waiting to be admitted. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. It surprised even her. She asked him one question. Was it real? On the other end of the line, silence gathered slowly, heavily, like storm clouds refusing to break. Adrian did not deny it. He did not rush into explanation. He exhaled once, and in that small surrender, Naomi heard the death of every excuse he had ever rehearsed. He told her things had become complicated. He said he had meant to tell her himself. He said she deserved a proper conversation when he returned. Returned. The word landed in her chest with such cold precision that she almost smiled at its cruelty. Returned from what? A negotiation. A mistake. A wedding. Naomi rose from the chair and walked toward the window, one hand supporting the underside of her belly, as if the child inside her had suddenly become the only truth with weight. 29 floors below, cabs moved through Midtown like streams of gold. In the reflection on the glass, she saw a woman in a silk dress standing inside a home that no longer belonged to her. Then she told him, not dramatically, not as a weapon, as fact. She said, "Adrian, I am pregnant." The silence that followed was no longer polished. It cracked. She heard him inhale sharply, heard him move away from whatever room he was in. The music faded. A door shut somewhere near him. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its effortless control. How far along? Naomi closed her eyes for one brief second. 7 months, she said. It is a boy. She had once imagined telling him those words with a smile against his shoulder, perhaps with his hand over hers, both of them laughing softly in disbelief. Instead, she delivered them into an ocean of distance, while his mistress waited somewhere in the wings of his new life. Adrian asked why she had not told him sooner. The question was so astonishing in its selfishness that Naomi turned from the window and looked at the table they were supposed to share. The roses, the silver, the candle wax beginning to pool like something melting beyond repair. She told him she had been waiting for a moment that felt like love. Another silence. He began to say her name again, but she interrupted him with a quietness sharper than anger. She did not ask whether he loved Vanessa. She did not ask whether this had been going on for months or years. She did not ask what kind of man married one woman while his child waited inside another. She already knew enough. Then Adrian said the one thing that would remain with her long after the call ended. He said, "Naomi, please do not make any decisions tonight." As if the night still belonged to him. As if he had any claim left over what would happen next. Naomi looked down at her wedding ring, at the circle of gold that had once felt like safety and now looked almost theatrical in its perfection. Her voice did not shake when she answered. "You already made the decision for both of us." And with that, she ended the call. The apartment fell still again, but it was no longer the stillness of waiting. It was the stillness that comes after a door has closed forever. Naomi stood in the center of the dining room, one hand over her unborn son, the other reaching for the velvet box that held the ring she would not be wearing by morning. And somewhere in Rome, Adrian Whitmore finally understood that he had not just betrayed his wife. He had abandoned the only two people who had ever truly been his. By dawn, the penthouse looked less like a home and more like the elegant remains of a life that had expired overnight. Naomi did not sleep. She moved through the apartment slowly, deliberately, as if each object deserved one final moment of recognition before she left it behind. In the bedroom, Adrian's side of the closet stood open, rows of custom suits arranged with the kind of order that had once made her feel secure. Now they looked like costumes waiting for a man she no longer knew. She packed only what mattered. Maternity dresses, medical records, the sonogram envelope, a framed photograph of her parents taken on a Cape Cod pier the summer before her mother died, and the soft, gray baby blanket she had hidden in the back of a drawer, bought on impulse after her 20-week appointment when the doctor told her she was carrying a healthy little boy with a strong heartbeat and long legs. The ring came last. She placed it in its velvet box and set it on Adrian's dresser without a note. No accusation. No final speech. Some endings were too sacred for performance. At 6:15 a.m., the first call came from Europe. She watched his name glow across the screen and let it fade. Then another. Then a message. "Naomi, please answer. We need to talk before this spirals." She looked at the words for a long moment, struck by how quickly men like Adrian mistook consequence for chaos. The spiral had started long before she saw the photo. It had started in every missed anniversary dinner, every business trip that lasted a little too long, every apology wrapped in expensive jewelry instead of honesty. By 8 o'clock, his mother called. Eleanor Whitmore's voice arrived cool and immaculate, the voice of old money trained to make cruelty sound like concern. She said there had been unfortunate press exposure in Europe. She said these situations were delicate and required discretion. She said Naomi must think carefully about the Whitmore name and avoid doing anything emotional. Naomi stood in the kitchen while the morning light spilled over white marble and polished chrome, making everything gleam with unbearable cleanliness. She listened without interrupting, then quietly informed Eleanor that her grandson was due in 11 weeks, and that discretion had stopped being her burden the moment Adrian chose another woman in public. For the first time since Naomi had known her, Eleanor Whitmore had no immediate reply. By noon, the first article appeared online. It did not mention Naomi by name, but it did not have to. European tabloid photos of Adrian and Vanessa leaving a Roman chapel spread quickly through financial blogs and society pages, wrapped in language like private ceremony and surprise union. A few outlets speculated about a confidential separation. Others praised Vanessa's style. Naomi closed her laptop after the third headline and understood something with sudden clarity. The world was not going to protect the truth for her. Wealth had too many ways of laundering shame into elegance. So she made a decision that felt less like rebellion and more like survival. By 2 o'clock, she had signed a lease for a furnished one-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side under her maiden name, Carter. It was smaller than the penthouse by nearly 2,000 square feet, with modest windows, old hardwood floors, and a radiator that clicked when the heat came on, but when she stepped inside, it held something the penthouse no longer could. Air. Honesty. Room to grieve without witnesses. The doorman downstairs helped carry 2 suitcases and a garment bag upstairs, calling her ma'am with uncomplicated kindness. When he noticed her hand resting protectively over her belly, he asked whether she needed anything else brought up from the car. Naomi nearly cried at the gentleness of it, but she only thanked him and said no. That evening, sitting on the edge of a bed that was not luxurious but was entirely her own, she unfolded the sonogram one more time. The grainy outline of her son shimmered beneath the lamplight, fragile and miraculous, untouched by lies, untouched by spectacle. Naomi traced the edge of the image with one fingertip and whispered the first promise she had made aloud since the world shifted beneath her feet. No matter what his father had chosen, this child would never grow up begging to be loved. Outside, Broadway traffic murmured through the early spring dark. Inside, Naomi Carter pressed the sonogram to her chest and began the quiet, brutal work of building a new life before her old one had even finished collapsing. The weeks that followed did not explode. They tightened. They narrowed Naomi's world into doctor appointments, legal paperwork, carefully measured grocery lists, and the quiet mathematics of survival. In the penthouse, money had moved around her like air, invisible and constant. In the apartment on West 79th Street, every dollar acquired shape and consequence. She learned the exact price of organic milk, prenatal vitamins, and cab rides when the subway stairs felt too steep for her changing body. She learned how long a radiator could clang before finally giving heat, how to sleep through sirens, and how loneliness sounded. In a one-bedroom after midnight, when there was no one left to disappoint but yourself, Adrian called every day for the first week, then twice a day, then from numbers she did not recognize. His messages shifted in tone the way seasons change over the Hudson, almost too gradually to notice until everything looked different. At first he sounded managerial, asking where she had gone, telling her they needed to handle things privately, assuring her he would fix what the press had twisted. Then came remorse dressed as confusion. Naomi, please let me explain. Naomi, it is not what it looks like. Naomi, I never meant for you to find out this way. She did not answer any of them. Explanations had become a luxury item, and she had no room left for what cost so much and gave back so little. Her attorney, a composed woman named Denise Harper with silver-streaked hair and a voice made for ending nonsense, advised immediate separation filings and temporary protections around marital assets. Naomi signed where she was told, her wedding band absent now, leaving her left hand strangely light and strangely honest. Denise never asked for the emotional version. She dealt in facts, dates, accounts, properties, public images. It comforted Naomi more than sympathy would have. Pain became easier to bear when translated into documents. Still, the body remembers what the mind tries to file away. At 32 weeks, Naomi's ankles swelled by evening. Her back ached with a deep, relentless pull that no pillow arrangement could fully soothe. Sometimes the baby kicked so sharply she stopped in the middle of the kitchen and gripped the counter until the movement passed, stunned by the force of a life still insisting on arrival. Those moments steadied her. Her son did not know scandal. He did not know betrayal, headlines, Roman chapels, or women in ivory. He only knew her heartbeat. He only knew that when he moved, she answered with a palm against her stomach and a whispered hello in the dark. One rainy Thursday, Naomi attended a prenatal appointment alone at Mount Sinai. The nurse asked whether the father would be joining for the final ultrasound, and Naomi smiled with such controlled grace that the woman immediately apologized for assuming. It was a small thing, barely a moment. Yet Naomi carried it home like a pebble in her shoe. In the elevator, surrounded by strangers smelling of wet wool and coffee, she watched her reflection in the mirrored walls and saw not a discarded wife, but a woman learning the discipline of being unchosen and still remaining whole. That evening, a garment box arrived at her apartment from Adrian's assistant. Inside was a cashmere maternity coat in deep camel, one she had once admired in a Madison Avenue window, along with a handwritten card that simply said, "I know you are cold." It was the first time his handwriting had touched her life since Rome. Naomi ran her fingers over the elegant slant of his letters, then folded the card in half and placed it back in the box. She kept the coat, not because gifts could repair betrayal, but because winter was real and pride did not keep a child warm. Outside, rain polished the city into silver. Inside, Naomi hung the coat by the door, then stood in the nursery corner she had begun to carve out beside her bed, where a small white bassinet waited under the glow of a second-hand lamp. She arranged a folded blanket, lined up 3 tiny onesies in a drawer, and pressed one hand to her belly as her son shifted beneath her skin. Somewhere across an ocean, or perhaps already back in New York, Adrian Whitmore might have been preparing another explanation, another apology, another expensive gesture mistaken for repair. But in that small apartment, among soft cotton and borrowed light, Naomi was building something he could no longer control. Not revenge, not spectacle, a beginning. The first snow of December came on a Sunday morning, soft and almost apologetic, brushing the fire escapes and window ledges in white, while Naomi stood in the labor and delivery suite with one hand gripping the bed rail and the other pressed against the place where pain and purpose had become the same thing. The room was bright in the clean, unforgiving way hospitals always were, but there was kindness in it too. A nurse with gentle eyes adjusted Naomi's blanket. Another tucked loose strands of hair behind her ear and told her she was doing beautifully, the way women tell one another the truth when the world has forgotten how. There was no husband in the chair beside her, no expensive coat draped over the armrest, no man pacing the hall, rehearsing fatherhood as if it were another boardroom role he intended to master. There was only Naomi, breath by breath, hour by hour, carrying herself through the hardest threshold of her life with a quiet that felt almost sacred. Denise arrived just after sunrise with a tote bag full of practical things Naomi had not thought to pack: lip balm, warm socks, a phone charger, a navy blue blanket for the baby. She did not speak in platitudes. She simply sat beside the bed when the contractions eased and handed Naomi iced chips with the steady presence of someone who understood that dignity was often more useful than comfort. Outside the hospital windows, the city moved through its winter rituals, horns muted by weather, coffee carts steaming on corners, strangers hurrying beneath scarves and umbrellas, unaware that in one bright room above them, Naomi Carter was bringing a new world into existence with no witness but God, fluorescent light, and her own astonishing strength. When the final hour came, it did not feel cinematic. It felt elemental. Everything narrowed to effort, breath, voice, heartbeat. Then suddenly the room changed. A sharp cry broke through the air, clear and indignant and alive, and Naomi's whole body went still in the wake of it. They placed her son against her chest, wrapped in a white hospital blanket with blue and pink stripes, his skin warm, his tiny face red with outrage at being brought into such a cold and complicated world. Naomi looked at him and understood immediately that love could arrive not as fireworks, but as gravity. Certain, absolute. He had Adrian's gray eyes, though they were still darkened by newness, and a mouth that curved at one corner as if already skeptical of everyone around him. Tears slipped quietly down Naomi's face, not from grief this time, but from the unbearable purity of finally meeting the one person who had kept her moving through every humiliation every legal form, every empty night. She named him Elliot James Carter, choosing a first name that felt strong without hardness, and her own last name with no hesitation at all. When the nurse asked whether she wanted the father's name listed on the temporary paperwork, Naomi looked down at her son's sleeping face and said not yet. The answer rested in the room like a bell after it had been struck. Later that afternoon, once the sky outside had turned silver with early dusk, her phone lit up with a message from Adrian. "I heard from my mother. Is the baby here?" Naomi stared at the screen while Elliot slept curled beside her in the bassinet, one miniature fist near his cheek, his breathing as delicate and rhythmic as snowfall. For a long moment she considered saying nothing. Then she opened the camera on her phone and took one photograph. Not his full face. Not enough to share. Just his tiny hand wrapped around her finger, impossibly small and impossibly sure. She sent it without caption. Adrian replied in less than 30 seconds. "Naomi, please. Please let me come." She read the message once and set the phone face down on the tray table beside a paper cup of untouched coffee. Then she lifted her son into her arms and held him against her heart, feeling the truth settle deeper with every breath he took. Adrian Whitmore had spent months choosing appearances over love, distance over duty, silence over honor. But this child had arrived untouched by all of it. And as snow continued to gather beyond the hospital glass, Naomi looked at her son and knew with a calm that felt almost fierce that the man who had abandoned them would not be allowed to enter this new life simply because he had finally remembered the door. The first 6 months of Elliot's life taught Naomi that exhaustion could be both brutal and beautiful. It lived in the purple half-moons beneath her eyes, in the cold coffee she kept reheating and forgetting, in the laundry folded at midnight while the city outside surrendered to spring. Yet it also lived in the sacred repetition of small things, the weight of her son against her shoulder after a bottle, the warm milk scent of his pajamas, the way his tiny fingers curled around one strand of her hair as if even in sleep he needed proof that she was near. Their apartment on West 79th Street became a universe measured not in square footage, but in rituals. Morning light across the bassinet. Stroller walks through Riverside Park. Late afternoon lullabies hummed over the sound of traffic drifting up from Broadway. Naomi learned to balance Elliot on one hip while answering emails with the other hand, to schedule conference calls around naps, and to rebuild a life in increments so small they would have looked invisible to anyone who had never had to start over with an infant in their arms. Before marriage, she had worked in strategic brand consulting, the kind of world where language shaped power and presentation shaped money. During her years with Adrian, she had let that part of herself recede, not all at once, but politely, gradually, the way women often surrender ambition in exchange for the promise of partnership. Now, with divorce proceedings moving forward and Whitmore money held at careful legal distance, Naomi returned to work from her dining table with a second-hand laptop, 2 freelance clients, and a determination so quiet it bordered on prayer. She named her consulting practice Carter House, after the last name she had reclaimed and the kind of life she intended to build beneath it. At first the projects were modest. A boutique skincare founder in Brooklyn who needed a better investor deck. A women-owned fashion label in Chicago trying to recover from a disastrous product launch. Naomi took every assignment seriously, dressing each morning in soft knits and gold hoops, as though even the smallest Zoom call deserved dignity. She had once lived among private drivers, black-tie galas, and penthouse views. Now she worked during Elliot's naps while sunlight moved slowly across the hardwood floor, and somehow the new life felt more honest than the old one ever had. Adrian remained a presence at the edges of that honesty. He sent letters now instead of gifts, thick cream envelopes delivered by courier, each one carrying a version of the same plea. He asked for forgiveness. He asked for photos. He asked whether Elliot had his eyes, his laugh, his hands. Naomi read every letter once and placed them in a box at the top of her closet beside the velvet ring case she had never reopened. She did not answer, not because she felt nothing, but because she had begun to understand the difference between remorse and repair. One was a feeling. The other was a discipline, and Adrian had not yet shown that he possessed it. By the time Elliot turned 1, Carter House had become more than survival. It had become momentum. Naomi's work carried the signature she had once hidden beneath Adrian's surname. and word spread quietly through networks of female founders, attorneys, and creative directors who trusted women who spoke with clarity instead of performance. She hired a part-time assistant, then a junior strategist. She moved from the dining table to a small studio office in a brownstone on the Upper West Side, with pale walls, brass shelving, and a window that overlooked a row of sycamore trees. On the shelf behind her desk sat one framed photo of Elliot laughing in a navy sweater, his gray eyes bright and startling against his warm skin. Clients often noticed it before they noticed the awards beginning to arrive. That was how Naomi wanted it. Success first belonged not to revenge, but to restoration. On the evening of Carter House's second anniversary, after putting Elliot to bed in a room painted soft ivory with clouds stenciled near the ceiling, Naomi stood alone in her office and looked out at the city she had once crossed as someone's wife and now inhabited as herself. The lights below shimmered against the river like scattered glass, and her reflection in the window no longer resembled the woman who had waited beside candlelight for a husband returning from a lie. She had become leaner in spirit, steadier in voice, more deliberate with her tenderness. In the silence of that room, with her name etched in gold on the office door behind her, Naomi finally understood that the life Adrian abandoned had not ended when he left. It had only changed authors. The invitation arrived on a Thursday in early October, embossed in gold on thick ivory stock, and delivered to Carter House by a messenger in a dark suit who addressed Naomi with the polished deference usually reserved for women who had never once been underestimated. The annual Whitmore Foundation Gala had long been one of Manhattan's most photographed charity nights, a cathedral of crystal chandeliers, old money, and carefully curated compassion. Years ago, Naomi had attended on Adrian's arm, wearing gowns chosen by stylists and a smile trained to survive rooms full of people who measured worth by lineage, not character. This year, the invitation named her alone. Naomi Carter, founder and chief strategist of Carter House, honored for her pro bono work helping women-led nonprofits rebuild after financial crisis. She read the card once, then set it beside her laptop and stared at the sycamore shadows moving beyond her office window. Fate, she had learned, rarely knocked without irony. Her assistant, Marisol, found her there 20 minutes later and asked whether she planned to attend. Naomi's gaze drifted to the framed photograph on her desk of Elliot at 4 years old, grinning through missing front teeth on a Cape May beach, his gray eyes bright beneath a navy baseball cap. He was in preschool now, quick-witted and observant, with Adrian's eyes and Naomi's stillness. She thought of cameras, of whispers, of the possibility that Adrian might be there after years of distance measured in letters, legal filings, and silence. Then she thought of every room she had walked into after he left, every contract she had won, every night she had stayed up building a life strong enough that her son would inherit steadiness instead of shame. By the time she looked back at the invitation, her answer had already formed. The gala took place 3 weeks later at the Astoria Crown, where the ballroom's ceiling rose like a painted sky, and the chandeliers cast light so flattering it could almost make hypocrisy look holy. Naomi arrived in a black silk gown cut with elegant restraint, long sleeves, a narrow waist, and a back that closed with a single row of pearl buttons. There was nothing fragile about the dress. It moved like composure. Beside her walked Elliot in a miniature midnight tuxedo, his small hand tucked into hers with absolute confidence, as though grand hotels and flashing cameras were simply another landscape to cross together. The moment they stepped onto the carpet, heads turned with the subtle violence of recognition. Not because Naomi looked familiar, though she did, or because success had sharpened her into something difficult to ignore, though it had. It was the child. People saw his face, then his eyes, then the impossible arithmetic began behind polite expressions. Naomi felt it happen around her like pressure change before a storm. She did not tighten her grip on Elliot's hand. She only bent slightly and smoothed the lapel of his jacket, her voice calm when she reminded him to stay close. Inside, the ballroom glittered with old alliances and newer ambitions. Naomi moved through it with the ease of someone who no longer mistook exclusion for judgment. Donors greeted her warmly. A city councilwoman praised her keynote at a leadership summit in Chicago. A magazine editor asked for an interview. Elliot accepted a glass of sparkling apple cider from a passing server with solemn courtesy, then whispered that the chandeliers looked like upside-down castles. Naomi smiled, and for one unguarded second, she forgot the Whitmore name attached to the evening at all. Then the room shifted. It was subtle at first, the way certain silences are. A ripple near the far entrance. A cluster of trustees turning all at once. Naomi lifted her gaze across the ballroom and saw Adrian Whitmore standing beneath the archway in a dark tuxedo that fit him as perfectly as regret never had. Time had refined him and hollowed him in equal measure. The arrogance that once made him beautiful from a distance had been replaced by something quieter, more dangerous. The look of a man who had finally run out of lies to hide inside. For one suspended second, he did not see Naomi. His attention was on a board member speaking at his shoulder, his face composed in the old public mask she knew too well. Then Elliot laughed at something near the dessert table, bright and unmistakable, and Adrian turned. Naomi watched the exact instant the world left his face. His gaze moved to her first, as though some part of him had always been trained to find her in a crowded room. Then it dropped to the little boy beside her, to the gray eyes, the Whitmore mouth, the unmistakable echo of himself standing where his past and his punishment had finally become visible. Adrian did not move. Neither did Naomi. Across the sea of crystal and candlelight, they looked at one another while the entire room kept breathing around them, unaware that the most important reckoning of the night had already begun. And beside Naomi, Elliot lifted his glass with both hands and smiled toward the stranger across the ballroom, not knowing that the man staring back at him had just come face to face with everything he had once abandoned and everything he no longer had the power to undo. For the rest of the evening, Adrian moved through the ballroom like a man walking inside the ruins of a house only he could see. Trustees greeted him. Investors extended hands. A state senator paused to congratulate him on the foundation's expansion into pediatric mental health. He answered when required, nodded when expected, and all the while his attention returned again and again to the same point across the room, to Naomi in black silk and the child beside her, who held himself with that startling combination of innocence and inheritance. Elliot was laughing now with the daughter of one of the donors near the silent auction tables, his small bow tie slightly crooked, one hand wrapped around a miniature eclair he had been instructed to eat over a napkin. Adrian noticed everything: the shape of the boy's mouth, the tilt of his chin when he listened, the gray of his eyes, so unmistakably Whitmore that it felt less like resemblance and more like accusation made flesh. He had spent years asking in letters whether the child had his eyes. Now he understood why Naomi had never answered. Some truths were too merciless for envelopes. Vanessa was not there. Their marriage had dissolved 18 months earlier in a quiet legal settlement that the press described as mutual and sophisticated, the kind of language wealth prefers when love collapses under the weight of vanity and ambition. Adrian had not loved Vanessa enough to stay shocked when the performance ended. What had remained after the divorce was not heartbreak, but emptiness. And beyond that emptiness, an ache he had never admitted aloud even to himself. He had told people the child was probably better off away from scandal. He had told his mother that Naomi hated him too much to allow contact. He had told his attorneys to remain respectful, patient, measured. Yet standing under crystal light while his son reached for a second pastry, and Naomi leaned down to wipe chocolate from the corner of the boy's mouth with the tenderness of long practice, Adrian was forced to confront the one truth none of those explanations could soften. Elliot had not grown up without a father because of circumstance. He had grown up without one because Adrian had chosen to be elsewhere. When the foundation chair announced Naomi's name for the recognition speech, the ballroom turned toward the stage in a swell of applause. Adrian did not clap at first. He simply watched her. Naomi crossed the room with Elliot's hand in hers until they reached the front row, where Marisol slipped into the seat beside the child and whispered something that made him grin. Then Naomi ascended the stage alone. The microphone caught the light at her cheekbone. She did not look at Adrian. She spoke about rebuilding after public failure, about institutions that forget women until women save them, about how dignity often begins in private long before the world decides to reward it. Her voice was calm, elegant, unadorned. There was no bitterness in it, which made it harder to bear. Every sentence seemed to reach the exact place in Adrian that had gone unexamined for too long. Not because she accused him, because she did not need to. Her life had become the closing argument. When the speech ended, the room rose in a standing ovation. Elliot clapped above his head with all the proud enthusiasm of a little boy who had not yet learned how adults ration emotion. Naomi smiled at him from the stage, and for a moment the entire ballroom disappeared for Adrian. There was only the woman he had once mistaken for permanence and the child he had mistaken for a complication that could wait. After the program, he finally moved. He crossed the marble floor slowly, as though suddenness might shatter what little access the moment allowed. Naomi saw him coming and straightened almost imperceptibly, one hand resting on Elliot's shoulder. Up close, Adrian looked older than his 41 years, not in the lines around his eyes, but in the gravity of someone who had spent too long understanding consequences only after they became irreversible. Elliot looked up first. Children have a way of receiving strangers without the history adults carry. He studied Adrian's face with frank curiosity, then glanced at Naomi as if to confirm whether politeness was required. Adrian's throat worked once before he managed to speak. He said hello to Elliot before he said Naomi's name. It was the first correct choice he had made in years, and still it landed too late. Elliot offered a shy hello back, his voice warm and open in a way Adrian had not earned. Naomi's gaze never softened. She introduced Adrian simply as someone she used to know. The words were gracious enough for public ears and sharp enough for private truth. Adrian looked at his son, really looked, and something in him seemed to give way without sound. In all his wealth, all his strategy, all his practiced command, he had never stood before a loss this complete. And as Elliot slipped his small hand into Naomi's, ready to follow her toward the photographers waiting near the ballroom doors, Adrian understood with devastating clarity that regret was not a feeling that passed through a man. It was a place he would now have to live. Outside the Astoria crown, Manhattan glittered beneath a sharp November wind, the kind that polished the night into something unforgiving and clear. Naomi kept one hand around Elliot's as they stepped past the photographers and toward the black car waiting at the curb, but before the driver could open the door, Adrian's voice reached them from behind with none of its former ease. He did not call her sweetheart. He did not use the soft public tone that had once made distance sound elegant. He simply said Naomi, and for the first time in years, it sounded like a man speaking without armor. She turned slowly, not because he still had power over her, but because refusing to hear him would have been too easy, and Naomi had not built this life on easy things. Elliot stood close against her side, one small hand clutching the satin fold of her gown, his eyes moving curiously between the adults as traffic hissed along Fifth Avenue and flashes from other arrivals lit the street in brief white bursts. Adrian stopped a few feet away, close enough for Naomi to see what time had done to him. He was still beautiful in the expensive, disciplined way men like him often were, but the beauty had thinned. Regret had a way of taking the shine off everything it touched. For a moment he looked at Elliot, then back at Naomi, as if he could not bear either sight for too long. When he finally spoke, there was no strategy left in him. He said he had spent years thinking about one night in Rome and every day that came after it. He said he had told himself there would be time to explain, time to repair, time to return when things were less public and less complicated and less humiliating for everyone involved. But time, he admitted now, had not softened what he had done. It had only made the shape of it clearer. Naomi listened without interruption, her face lit by the soft gold from the hotel entrance. The city moved around them, indifferent and immense. Adrian said he had watched her build a life from a distance because he thought it was what she wanted, because his guilt had become its own form of cowardice, because every year that passed made knocking on her door feel less like hope and more like trespass. Then his voice broke in the smallest possible way when he looked down at Elliot and said the words that mattered more for being late. I should have been there when he was born. I should have been there for all of it. Elliot leaned slightly into Naomi, not frightened, simply uncertain. Naomi lowered her gaze to her son and brushed a hand over his hair with practiced tenderness before looking back at Adrian. There were 1,000 things she could have said. She could have listed every unanswered appointment, every fevered night, every school form signed with one hand while cooking dinner with the other. She could have spoken of the apartment, the legal papers, the second-hand bassinet, the coat he sent when winter had already arrived too deep for gestures to matter. But dignity had taught her long ago that the sharpest truths required the fewest words. She told him that he did not come back because love had finally made him brave. He came back because loss had finally made him lonely. The sentence settled between them with the precision of glass placed on marble. Adrian closed his eyes for a second, as if receiving a verdict he had known was coming. When he opened them again, there was nothing left to defend. He asked whether there would ever be a chance to know his son. Naomi did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at Elliot, at the boy who had grown inside grief and come out radiant, the child who knew bedtime stories, piano lessons on Tuesdays, pancakes on Saturday mornings, and a mother whose love had never once arrived late. Then she said that forgiveness and return were not the same thing. She told Adrian she had forgiven him long ago, not because he deserved peace, but because she and Elliot did. As for the rest, she said, a child was not a prize a man reclaimed when his other choices failed. If Adrian wanted to build something now, it would have to be built slowly, honestly, and without expectation. No grand gestures, no claims, no stepping over years as if money or sorrow could shorten them. Adrian nodded once, the movement almost imperceptible, as though even gratitude would be too loud in the face of what she had spared him and what she had denied. Elliot, in the solemn generosity only children possess, lifted one small hand and gave Adrian a shy wave. Adrian looked at that wave the way starving men look at bread. Naomi opened the car door and helped Elliot inside, then paused with one hand against the frame. The wind lifted a loose strand of hair from her cheek, and for one suspended second, she looked exactly as she had years ago and nothing like that woman at all. She told Adrian to begin, if he meant it, by becoming the kind of man a child could trust when no one was watching. Then she entered the car and closed the door softly behind her. As the sedan pulled away from the curb, Adrian remained standing beneath the Astoria's golden lights, alone in a tailored tuxedo, watching the only family that had ever truly been his disappear into the bright river of Manhattan traffic. Inside the car, Elliot leaned sleepily against Naomi's shoulder and asked whether the sad man outside knew them. Naomi kissed the top of his head and looked out at the city she had once survived and now belonged to. She said, very gently, he knew us too late. And as the skyline blazed beyond the window like a kingdom made of second chances, Naomi Carter held her son close and understood that the finest form of justice had never been making Adrian suffer. It was leaving the night with everything he once failed to value and everything she had rebuilt without him.